been back here in a minute. Hi, Damian.
Hello, well, welcome back. Hi, Anne. How are you?
I'm really hot. There's a
Yeah.
heat wave in New York. That's why the seltzer was so critical because it is 97 degrees outside. That's how I am.
Well, I'm sorry, how many?
97.
97.
Like I'm 3 degrees away from a three-digit number. That's how.
Wow. Wow, you were handling that well. My goodness.
Well, and hence also the worrying over what to wear on Zoom. That's like doesn't make me look naked, but then
Okay.
allows me
This
to
is
exist in 97-degree weather. Like
This
there's
is
a lot to
making more
solve for.
sense. Well, I'll have you know that here in Minneapolis, it is a balmy 80, 83. I
And I
think
bet
we're
the
around
I
83.
bet the humidity is great there too.
I mean, I had lunch outside today.
Sure you did.
I did. Me and a lovely plate of scallops celebrated the Minneapolis version of summer. But I miss you and I miss New York and I miss your 97 degrees. You know, I miss it. So what have you been listening to during this hot time, this heat wave of sorts?
What have I been listening to?
Yeah, that's always a favorite question of mine.
Yeah, no, sort of all over. Um, been revisiting some clarinet repertoire
Oh
that I've
yeah.
been studying. Um, and
Such
that
as.
includes like the Brahms Clarinet Quintet, along with the Samuel Coleridge Taylor Clarinet Quintet.
Now, when you
Um,
say clarinet quintet, that's not five clarinets, though, right?
Correct. I mean, sometimes it is, but in
Yeah.
this, and which I would really prefer to disassociate from, but this is a single clarinet with a string quartet. Um,
Nice.
and yeah, I'm a clarinetist for folks who don't know. So, and I love actually chamber music of all kinds, even sometimes a weird many woodwind situation, like what I was just joking about. But I would say one of my favorite configurations is quartet with clarinet because it just offers like so many different ways for the different instruments to like personalities and timbres to just kind of
Yeah.
shine through and complement with one another.
Yeah.
um and I you know I think a lot of clarinetists are like, oh yeah, I love clarinet quintets because it's like about the clarinet, but I actually generally prefer sections where like I'm more in the kind of inner harmony and able to like let the first violin or the cello or whomever like have their moments while
Yeah.
I'm like chugging along and like supporting them underneath. So,
I also feel like the clarinet plays well with others.
it does.
I feel like the different registers of clarinet just blend well with different instruments. I think that's something really unique about it.
Well, it does have so many different, it contains so many different timbres and sounds and registers. I mean, every musician of any instrument is going to say, like, my instrument sounds like the human voice the most. But I do feel like clarinetists like have something to say as far as like, it is a very, I think a broader color palette than some of the other wind
Hmm.
instruments. Um, but what have you been listening to?
You know what? I've been listening to something slightly different than my usual. So I just finished this like crazy 2 week retreat. Lots of things happened, but one of the great things happened is I met this artist named Gideon Crevichet, and he's a really really cool vocalist, among other things. But he has a band. It's called a band, but it's like this like mixture of like neoclassical music and folk. Anyway, his album just came out, and I've been listening to it voraciously for like the last week. I'm kind of like slightly obsessed with it. It's the group is called Briars of North America,
Huh.
and the album is called Supermoon. So but it's got lots of acoustic instruments, but there's also like
Mm.
some electronics involved. But it really has a home in like neoclassical music. Like the musicians involved have a lot of crossover into like neoclassical realm, and it's just really really fascinating. But it's one of those albums. It's not it's not like it's not really a concept album per se, but it kind of has that concept album quality in that it's kind of like transportive.
Mm.
It's
Mm.
kind of that. And I guess I've been in this weird kind of place where I don't know if I've been in need of escapism, but I think I've been in need of escapism, like just a little bit. And so like it's really good for that. Um, so that's kind of what I've been listening to. So it's been like this weird, and the album is this weird mashup of double bass because one of the players is a classically trained double bassist
Mm,
who now lends his talents to a lot of neoclassical things, and I think he's closely affiliated with like Bang on a Can, that
hmm
collective,
hmm
and things like that. But anyway, it's a really interesting album, and Gideon himself sings on it, and he like sings in
hmm
an invented language at times, which is also very interesting. But yeah, that's what I've been listening to. Crazy wacky. That, and then I've been listening to. Speaking of quintets, there's a quintet. Oh my goodness, I'm not gonna remember his name because I'm thinking of it. But I'll look it up. I'll answer back with the composer's name in a moment. But he wrote the. It's called the Tempest Fantasia.
Hmm.
It won a Pulitzer. Goodness, I can't remember his name because I'm thinking of it.
Let
But
me
it's
just ask the internet. Tempest Fantasia.
you could ask the internet, or I could also just open my iTunes and just look at the
Stomu
cover.
Yamashita.
Nope, that's not the one.
Okay, there was someone else who wrote. Oh no, wait. Oh, Paul Moravec.
Yes, that is the one. I'm obsessed. And also the cellist on that is in my ensemble.
Mm.
So it was another high, like, oh, listen to her play, listen to her play. But it was fabulous. If you get a free moment and you're just like, oh, I need some more quintet action in my life, I highly recommend that one.
Well, I see clarinet in the instrumentation,
There is a
so
clarinet.
out of self-interest, I will absolutely check it out.
It's very, very enjoyable. That one's like on my like top 25 playlist. You know how your phone likes to do that for you?
Mm,
It's always there because I make it back to the Tempest at least once every 2 weeks.
wow. Well, I think today's conversation is sort of our look back on like in this experiment that's been this YouTube show, like what would be in our top five or so as far as like different sorts of subjects or topics that we've covered, and then also to give a preview to folks as far as like what there is to come, because this isn't a goodbye. This is more like a pause, and also just a like a moment to kind of, I think that the world right now honestly is sort of resetting. You know, it's funny what you were saying, that you didn't, but you do need to have this sort of form of escapism, because I think right now with things starting to relax, and but then all this like ambiguity around like delta variants and like like the world is like starting to come back, but it's in a lot of sort of fits and starts.
Yeah,
um
yeah,
and so like I think part of this moment for the Dream Unfinished too is like we are actually, and I'll be sharing a little bit more detail later on in today's conversation, but like we will be resuming in-person performances in August, which is honestly exciting and a little scary, you know? And so
yeah,
like and as we are now shifting back to producing live events, then it's like, okay, let's make sure, because obviously we've learned so much and there's so much to be gained from maintaining our channel and these conversations, but then like what is a rhythm and like what is a schedule that makes sense so that we can be taking care of all of these things while we also have all of our own other lives, right? Because like
yeah,
all of us have day jobs. The TD
yeah,
work is stuff that we love to do, and we need to have it kind of all fit within the same jigsaw puzzle.
yeah. And the other thing that's so weird about that is, yes, we are reopening, and there's these feelings of like exultation, right? Like we're finally we're free, you know, from our homes. But then it's also like this re-entering this uncertain place, and now there's this other whole dynamic of like, yes, you're vaccinated or you aren't vaccinated, and you don't need a mask or you do need a mask, and like this is like all this weird thing, and like there's some people still working from home, but some people have returned to the office, and so like what are even like the times of meeting? Like we don't even know what that is. Like are we going to return to this 9 to 5 structure? Are we going to return to a brand new structure? You know, is it still like this kind of, hey, we got this performance model of 40 minutes, no intermissions, because that's the thing? Or is it a whole different, we've now come off this whole world of YouTube and virtual consumption. Like, do we even still have the endurance for like things that last longer than
Mm-hmm.
15 minutes? It'll be very interesting to see what the landscape is like, especially with consumption of live performance. I'm very curious to see what lands and what kind of feels foreign, you know.
Well, from what I can tell, and I'd be curious to also trade notes as far as like what you're seeing in Minneapolis versus what I'm seeing in New York, but people are definitely hungry for live performance. And I think, you know, it is this like very awkward thing now of and now that Cuomo's lifted a lot of the restrictions, it's less of this, but it was like you would have to like go through all this rigmarole to even just get a ticket anywhere. And
Mm.
then once you show up, you need to like either like be masked or show proof of vaccination or whatever. But like people are willing to go through all these hoops just to be in a room with a bunch of strangers for 45 minutes again. Like people really want that.
Oh my
How is
goodness.
it in Minneapolis?
In Minneapolis, it's just kind of open, like literally and figuratively. It's open. Like everything is open. There's no mask mandate whatsoever in the
Oh
state of
wow.
Minnesota. It's and people are going with it. People don't seem as has. I mean, some people are still wearing the masks. You know, people who feel that they want and need to. It doesn't seem like it's awkward or there's any kind of social pressure not to wear a mask.
Good.
But there are no mandates, and so I mean, they just kind of like just switched the lever, and it's just been like the waters have started flowing again, and there were just like live events everywhere. Today I just ran a few errands. I decided to take a scenic walk to get there, and like it's even to the point that they have this avenue here and it's just lined with live performers.
Mm.
It's kind of like our like the subway system, how you kind of register and you get to be a performer in this little area. You have that's your little thing
Oh.
for the day. They
Hmm.
have it all up and down this avenue, but all the stalls were filled. I mean, it was just when I say I literally probably passed like 20 different musicians performing. I mean that.
Wow.
Like all the
Yeah.
live venues are just back open. I mean, they're already in full swing for closed hall performances. Um,
Hmm.
it just it seemed like there's like almost zero hesitation, I would say. Like it's just and we're back. It's just kind of like that here, which in a way is great. Hopefully that's the correct decision. Because if it isn't the correct decision, Minneapolis is going to feel it because they've just jumped in like head under, like we're just here, which is exciting though because people are, again, they're hitting it with all this gusto. There's just so much programming now. There's something every day of the week,
Yeah.
and it's so varied. There's quartets, there's solo numbers, there's experimental things, there's theater,
Mm.
there's I mean, it's just everyone has just been like waiting at the starting line, hind up, and like they're just like, they're just hitting the ground running. So
Yeah.
so that part's exciting. But again, I'm more curious about what the actual consumption will be. I know the appetite is there. I'm
Hmm.
just curious as to what the process is going to be when people are listening. Like what's the feeling going to be in the room? What's the feeling going to be in the space? Like we'll see. I have high hopes though. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah.
And it
Well,
also appears that like lots of people have been working and writing, and
mhm.
there's just lots of new repertoire and lots of new things happening. That part's very exciting.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And as far as what we're planning on doing, as far as our great return to in person, um, it will be an outdoor engagement. We are working on figuring out all the final details, but it should be with really wonderful partners that we have in Queens on August 21st at the Jamaica Center for Arts and Learning.
Nice.
And it's the skeleton of the plan right now. We'll be announcing more formally next week, but is like a health fair actually.
Oh.
So what we're really hoping to do is getting like a solid 5 or 6 hour block where we get really a wide range of folks who do work around healthcare equity for communities of color. And
Ah.
so, some of the things that we've researched include like this app that was actually started and it's specifically meant to encourage meditation for communities of color. There's also this group that does, it connects uh, pediatricians who accept Medicare with families who are Medicare eligible. There's another group that does work around like telehealth opportunities for young parents of color. So like we're trying to see however many of those organizations we can gather, and so
Mhm.
that they can table. And so that we can just make sure that people are aware of this really great work that's already taking place. And then having these sets, it'll probably be like piano and vocals, or maybe some actually even mixed vocal ensembles, but doing these like 20 or 30-minute sets throughout the day. And they would be pointing, and like in classic TDU fashion, it would be something like, of like a vocalist, like a Jasmine Wilson, hopefully if she's free, like saying like, I'm going to perform this
Jasmine.
piece by Florence Price, and this piece is about Florence Price wrote this, like actually the episode that we did, To My Little Son. So, Florence Price wrote this piece to my little son, and it was from her vantage as a young mother. And for the young mothers out there, check out that table where you can learn more about research. So like we're trying to like tie in whatever is getting performed on stage with the groups that will hopefully be showing up that day. So
Nice. So it's like a full health fair avec entertainment.
yeah.
I like it.
Well, because our typical model for TDU concerts is really more like concert plus. And I think this is actually flipping it a little bit, where it's a little bit more about the fair element and the tabling and people being able to get connected with these resources. But then like with the added sort of framing of these musical performances that are sort of scattered throughout, because I think actually speaking to your point around consumption, like, and also just around like, how do I put this, like planning, like, I think it's harder now, especially since we're in this funny sort of transitional moment, to expect people to know with certainty that they can like buy a ticket for a 90-minute performance 8 weeks from now. And so what we're really kind of planning for instead is like, it's a fair, and like it can be more like people come in and out on their own time, and like sort of capturing street traffic and foot traffic and that sort of stuff, rather than this like dedicated events. Because yeah, like I think people are just so unable, really, because of work commitments, because of trying to figure out their own lives and their own like am I showing up to work in the office today or not, like all of that sort of stuff makes it really hard for people to commit to something in advance. So I think that's one of the ways that we're trying to accommodate for that.
Well, that sounds pretty exciting. And I'm glad you're doing it on healthcare. I think that's also very well timed for obvious reasons. And that reminds me of like, we also did that episode, I guess maybe a few weeks ago on, I think it was as part of the redlining trilogy, if you will, but it was based on health. And because the thing that was interesting about that was we were really talking about trauma, right? It was like trauma, and I think a lot of people were gonna feel some kind of post-traumatic disorder to some degree or other. And speaking of music, so did you remember from that episode there was a piece by, oh my goodness, Allison Luggins Hull, and she created this piece about I think it was called like the Inheritor, hold on, the Inheritor's Overture. And it was specifically about inherited trauma, but it's related to like how do you deal with trauma, and it was like an exploration of trauma. And of course in that case it was specifically about inherited trauma, but I think we're just going to really have to address the trauma people have felt, and like the psychological effects of this like shutdown and quarantine and anxiety. We've all been existing with this high level of anxiety that I think lots of people will benefit from, a checkup from the neck up, and just being really aware of mental health. I think we're entering an era where mental health is, well, A, very necessary, but B, very in the fore of people's minds. So I think this is a great time to really destigmatize, mental health. If nothing else has been, obviously this pandemic didn't really bring anything good, but if something could be gleaned that's positive from it, is like, I'm at least glad that it's made some effort to destigmatize mental health.
No, I think you're 100% correct on that. And what I would add too is, actually, you just mentioned the redlining episode. I think another thing that the pandemic did was really just, America has been living with a lot of issues for a long time, and the pandemic really forced us to confront those. And like we've always had like bread lines, but the bread lines got that much longer. We've always had like redlining. We've had so many issues that have been a result of this inherited and generational discrimination. And like now that and it's and like, because the pandemic showed like who was in a social station and class that they were able to stay home in their bubbles, and who had to be out and all of a sudden had the title of an essential worker, but then they're still getting like nothing, in terms of like wages or benefits or safety. Like I just,
Yeah.
so like I hope that now that that is like, it's so undeniable, like you can't unsee some of this.
Mm.
I hope that that is also something that people can really start to more actively solve for, and to really be more thoughtful around like these macroaggressions that are shared between different,
Mm. Hmm.
racial groups and across the geography of the US.
You, you said something specifically that I want to say something about the bread lines. I thought the bread lines for me were very telling, and there was one specific reason, and it was just because I was exposed to it without choice. Because our last apartment in the heart of Harlem, there was something great that happened around 125th. It's just such a central location. There's like so many subway lines join there. It's a place people can get easily, and so a lot of groups stationed their humanitarian efforts there, whether it was just food giveaways or free vaccinations or this, da, 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 da. But there was a bread line. I don't remember who was the supplier, but they kind of had their food truck around the corner from my brownstone. And all I could see, I couldn't see the truck, but all I could see was the line, because the line ended up winding down our block. And I remember at first it was just really difficult to see, because it's one thing to read about and hear the numbers, and it's another thing to like see them standing underneath your window, and you're just like, oh my goodness, they're standing in this line. I'm sitting here waiting for my Whole Foods delivery. And it was that dichotomy. But the other thing that was so telling about it and so interesting to me is that I started paying attention to the shoes. And I know that sounds a little random, but I noticed that early on in the breadline life, existence, there were certain kinds of shoes. There were lots of casual shoes, sneakers, just casual shoes. And as the pandemic rolled on, and as people had to exist with this, and maybe perhaps out of work, there were different communities of people who had never had to be without before. And then all of a sudden, there were different shoes in the bread line. There were a lot more loafers. There were a lot more, leather soled shoes from Brooks Brothers. There were all kinds of there were just so many different kinds of groups of people who all of a sudden, for the first time in their lives, found themselves in a position of need. And so the other thing I hope that comes from this, and again, nothing really good is good about the pandemic, but I think in addition to the mental health awareness and treatments being destigmatized, I hope things like welfare and like community programs to help people in need also become a little destigmatized, because we like to have this word welfare mean all these kinds of things when associated to certain kinds of groups, but all of a sudden we forget that unemployment,
Mm-hmm.
that,
Yep.
that is still welfare, but we call it that. These small business grants and all these other little kinds of grants and monies that came out from the federal government going to certain
That's right.
kinds of people, we didn't call that welfare, and they all walked around thinking, oh yes, I'm getting through the situation with a little help. But I just really hope that now that everyone's had a dose of needing help from organizations and the federal government,
Yeah.
when this is over, I hope we don't continue to marginalize and demonize people who find themselves in need of some of these programs. I hope we don't keep pointing fingers at people who live in public housing or
Mm-hmm.
or socialized medicine sorts of things. Like, I just hope we all remember that, like, you know, just because it took a pandemic for certain people in their communities to be touched, other communities are touched by way lesser
Mm-hmm.
stimulants. You know what I mean? Like things that have existed for always in their culture. Some people have never caught up to to a fair kind of playing field. So I just hope people remember, and just remember these times of like, hey, this wasn't my fault. This is the way things were set up, and I needed help. I just hope everyone remembers that going forward. That there are communities who have that particular scenario with or without a pandemic in America. So
Yeah,
we'll
absolutely.
we'll see what happens with that. But
Well, and
yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's this, not only, you're absolutely right that there needs to be a wider embrace of, and I guess like for anyone who's listening in, they probably get, I think where at least some of the members of the Dream Unfinished and our political inclinations are probably clear. But I will say to officially disassociate that, personally, I feel that we would just be in a world of greater good if there was more openness with an active and involved and engaged state.
Yeah.
So not only is it these like social services and programs like you're describing, but then also like to really take a step back as far as like regulation. Like how can we not only, like, how do I put this, like put in these sorts of and destigmatize these sorts of supports and benefits so that the symptoms of the problem can heal. But then how can we also get to fixing the problem in the first place? Like, getting like undoing the like things like redlining, actually having equitable access to healthcare so that these sorts of disparities aren't so pervasive. So
Absolutely.
And I think like we call ourselves an activist orchestra, and I think the hope is that we are, because I'm frank with people, like if you come to the Dream Unfinished performances, like you buying a concert ticket is not fixing incarceration, it's not fixing immigration or anything like that, but my hope is that we make enough noise about it and that there are people who then are coming up for the first time or tuning in and really just being made aware of these kinds of issues that they've otherwise wouldn't necessarily know because they're hiding at home getting their home foods delivered. Like they can, like, to be able to just raise that awareness and then hopefully also inspire enough people to do whatever it is that they can from as an individual, whether that's voting or whatever sort of ways in which they can be more directly related with policy.
Yeah.
That's what we're after.
The other thing I think is interesting, and I'm really curious, again, nothing good comes from a pandemic, but if something positive had to be gleaned from said pandemic, I also love how there has been a shift in grants and commissions to other communities. You know what I mean? All of a sudden we understood people who have different perspectives on certain topics have things to share, and their music is worthy of a grant every now and then. It should be produced and performed by an ensemble every now and then. And I really am very curious to see how much of that sticks, because I think one of the things that was so enriching about this experiment, as you called it, this YouTube experiment, was that, at least for myself, I was forced, in addition to like my normal inclinations anyway, but I was also forced to really pay attention and listen to different kinds of voices, right? Like it was like, oh my goodness, here's a horrible thing that happened this week. This community is under siege and suffered some kind of great loss. That is horrible. But it did make us at least focus on that group for a while, and like not just their pain, but also their products, right? Like there were a lot of different composers who got lots of light during this year. There were lots of women who had lots of headlining commissions, not just, oh, we need one. Oh, we need one of these. There were lots of just like headline orchestras and huge ensembles and huge grants and huge foundations and huge award winners that went to all different kinds of communities over the last year and a half. And I really am grateful for the work that I've been able to hear from a lot of these people, whether it's, the Courtney Bryans of the world, who I clearly have a soft spot for. I'm a little biased, I must say, but I love her work. And Helle Negron, oh my goodness. Again, I might be a little biased there, but I love her work. It's just like so many voices got a time, not just to shine because they're different, but they got a time to shine because they were the expert. They were the expert on what needed to be said at a given time. You know what I mean? So I really hope we continue to give out these grants and fellowships and opportunities to the quote unquote experts at the time and on a field, and let people speak for themselves. I think that is what, for me, if I could start over and say more succinctly, I think this was a time we got to hear people speak for themselves. It wasn't this one hollowed group giving their opinion about other communities. People got to speak for themselves on larger platforms. And I think our musical quilt, if you will, became way more colorful and rich
Mhm.
for it. And I'm really excited to see going forward how that continues. I just think commissioning and it was just really exciting during
Mhm.
this time. And maybe it was because everything was happening from home or
Mhm.
different locations, so it wasn't an issue of, oh, we've got to fly everyone here, we got to fly. I mean, maybe that was the thing, but I think it's something deeper. I think it's, in addition to like this hunger you were saying for live performance, I think there's also this hunger from all the different kinds of voices. I really do think America has, we it's the spice of life. And I think like our cuisine and like our foods, I think we've moved to a place in our music and our art consumption that we want more than
Mhm.
just 16th to 18th century European. I think we want other spices now. And I hope that's another thing that sticks. I hope so.
No, I love that metaphor, and it reminds me of, Terrence McKnight has been a perennial figure in
Oh,
my community,
Terrence.
and he very often uses a similar metaphor around like a diet and like balancing a musical diet, because like what is it? Like I'm not going to remember exactly, but there's some statistic where it's like in 2016 to 17, 35% of orchestral performances were programming Beethoven, but like point 0.5 0.5 for programming all Asian composers. So like that would be like Terrence would give that as an example of like, yeah, that's like way too much chicken on your plate. And you're like, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like so like
Right.
I appreciate that like there's a more of an effort for it. I guess like I'll say one thing really quickly, but I want to go back to this idea of like broadening the musical cult, because I think this experiment has allowed TDU to do that too. But like the one thing that I want to make sure is I agree with you that we've certainly been able to hear so many more voices, but I hope that we get better at it. And it is, you know, more around preemptively and proactively celebrating a community, rather like I think I was a friend of mine shared an interview that the writer and poet Ocean Vuong had done recently, and he
Mm,
was asked to give he's Vietnamese American, and he was asked to give his take on like the the shootings in Atlanta and the recent sort of uptick in hate incidents against the AAPI community, and he very specifically and very candidly said like, I don't want to suddenly become relevant because 6 women are dead. You
yeah.
know, like there
Yeah.
is this like couldn't we have had, enjoyed the body of work from a community before the community is like sensationalized as victims in the news, like so like how do we not, and I talk about this all the time, like how do we not chase ambulances? Like how do we,
Yeah.
like be more around like just there is this incredible totality of voices that exists in our community, and how do we get ahead and just go ahead and celebrate that
Right.
instead of like waiting for the next tragedy to happen. So
Right.
I think in some ways that's because that's also very transparently been something that I think the Dream Unfinished has struggled with. Like, how do we obviously we care about drawing attention towards issues like what we've been discussing, like the redlining,
Right.
like health disparities, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then like, how do we do that and then also be able to champion these composers that we feel so strongly about? But then it's not like it's not another form of like ghettoization, like, oh, there's this terrible thing, now we're going to present a composer of color. And like I think it's this awkward and liminal space that we're in, that we're also like exploring ways of stretching beyond. Like we are hopefully going to be ironing out all the details, but doing this amazing commission with Joelle Bentley Thompson, and it's to set the poetry of James Emmanuel. Like it's not something terrible happened, please write a piece of music about it. So like I think like, and this whole YouTube experiment has really allowed us to just explore composers in a way that we haven't been able to otherwise, because our previous model had been this like, this is the year's theme, and then this is how, whereas like we've been able to touch on so many different themes and so many different topics and be able to really hear a lot more composers than like we would even in a single season, because usually the way that we had operated was like some chamber concerts, and then one orchestral concert, as you know, because we featured you. And then like the 4 or 5 composers in the orchestral concert would be represented in the chamber concert. So each year we would really only get to know like 4 or 5 composers.
Mm.
Whereas this YouTube experiment has allowed us to like, I don't know, there's like what, like 15 videos here already, and so it's like a different composer in every single one.
Right.
And something that we haven't really had a chance to do previously. So I'm really grateful that it's broadened, you know, our horizon and who we have on our playlist and who we can plan on including in future in-person and virtual performances.
That's all very exciting. I'm glad you pointed out that, like, you know, we are more than requiems and funeral dirges. You know, we've got joy and celebratory music in us too, right? Like,
Yes.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because that is something that you are. I mean, you know, they love to hear they love to hear somebody weeping and wailing. You know, they love that. They love a prayer. You know, Lord, please
Yeah.
help us.
Yeah.
They're always down to hear us singing something about Jesus, please help us. But yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's so funny. So looking forward though,
Yes.
what what do you want to do with this experiment? What has this led you to want to do next with this fair YouTube channel?
Well, I definitely want us to keep doing it. I think probably just not once a week because of, again, like now we're going to ramp up into in-person performances capacity wise, I don't think it makes the most sense. So probably more like we would take some time and actually do more pre-filming, and then we would
Yeah.
release like a mini series, like 3 or 4 episodes on a given topic, or to do like a deep dive in something. Um, and also thinking around like how to broaden the folks that are in our network and releasing not only on YouTube but also via podcast, because you know there are folks who would prefer to just have us in their ears and on their screens, and that's okay.
Yeah.
um, and I would really like to do some content that's less conversational and more sort of short form, like 6 to 8 minute videos that do like a sort of and like what I would actually really love to experiment with is doing things that explain stuff in classical music that I think classical musicians take for granted that the broader world doesn't have a clear understanding around. Like I would love to do something on the blind audition and like why it
Ah.
happened, what it's resulted in, but then also like why there is some clamoring, particularly around underrepresented communities in classical music, to do away with the blind audition. So like to be able to kind of unpack these things that are so much in the vernacular of our industry, but then like making it clear. And because the blind audition is actually an interesting example where like it ended up having implications for other industries, like how to, you know, look at a resume and, you know, and redact the names so that people aren't exhibiting any implicit bias around any assumptions with the nationality of the person and that kind of stuff. So like I think like whatever sort of extrapolations from classical music that have played out in the broader world, I would love to do some like series that just give people like a sense and an overview of what it is, why it matters, and how it matters moving forward.
You know, it's so funny. I won't go too deep into this blind audition. I think that's another whole episode, right? I mean, I've got so many thoughts, but I do find it funny that in addition to blind auditions, like you said, redacting names, all this stuff, it's so interesting to me how much effort we openly do and understand it's necessary to, like, you know, avoid the racism, you know, to, you know, let's subvert the racism, but then at the same time, and we'll all celebrate that that's necessary and all these things are necessary in order for it not to happen. But then, like, in the same conversation, you know, people are like, there's no racism, we don't do that. I'm like, but okay, all right, well, you know, you don't do it, but you understand, but you're engaging in this. It's such an interesting conversation. It's kind of like, you know, like the amendments in our constitution in general, right? Like I always like point out, how many panels have we done over the last year just about like rights,
Mm,
basic rights, and all this kind of stuff. And one of the things I always like to point out to people, this is a complete tangent, not related at all, but I think it's worthy of hearing. You know, I always like to point out to people, like, you know, we don't have any amendments in our constitution that gave anyone any rights. Like they didn't give suffrage to women, they didn't
that's
give
right.
voting rights. Like those amendments stopped a population from denying a group of people
That's
the
right.
rights that were already given in the original document, right? So it's like when you put it in terms like that, it makes things like, I don't know, the storming of the White House. It makes things like that look different when you think about like, oh, we've had like at least 27 laws to keep a certain population of people from denying rights to people. Every single one of them is addressed at telling one community to stop doing something and to start doing what the rules say. So I just think it's this is very interesting to look at that way. I think it's interesting to look for that going forward in our industry as well. There are certain things that are being implemented, and I think it's so easy sometimes for the focus of these changes, whether it be the structure between musicians and just whatever, right? I think it's important to remember who these changes are affecting, not
Mm-hmm.
just who they're benefiting, but whose behavior these changes are meant
Mm-hmm.
to change. And I think when you look at it that way, it makes people feel a little differently how they walk around. You don't have to walk around like you're getting something, because that's how I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes it's packaged. I mean, all these changes are giving something. Now you guys can play with us too. I'm like, no, we've always been able to play with you. It's just because you tell us that I mean, it's a lot of that. And also in this era, and Dream Unfinished is my favorite example. I use your ensemble all the time as an example of this. I think we're entering this celebrated phase of building tables, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we're still in this time of making sure we get our seat at the table, but whilst we're trying to get that seat at that table, we are very, 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 very devoted to building tables,
Mm-hmm.
because we have resources, we have talent, we have people, we have composers, we have performers, we have people who make it, we have everything. So I think we're coming to a point where it's not just, hey, allow people to have seats at this table. It's like, do it, or you're going to lose access
Mm-hmm.
to groups of people, because you're not the only game in town. Like, people are going to go other places, like startup businesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once upon a time, if you wanted to go into certain industries, you had to do what you ever had to do. You had to play the game and join somebody else's thing. Now you can start your own. Like, the internet makes it really easy to start a business at home. You know what I mean? It's really easy to write your own music these days. It's really easy to put a group together
Mm-hmm.
and do some stuff. So I just use Dream Unfinished all the time, because I think there are a lot of smaller ensembles that have managed to successfully find a little, their lane.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the Dream Unfinished is very unique in that it's such a large ensemble with such a large presence. The fact that you've been able to do that on such a large scale and have such a fantastic reach, and keep your voice very clearly addressing important topics, and not really deviating from that. I think it's very, very commendable. There's a lot of, I'm in this whole area now where, you're writing grants for things to fund your projects, and these questions are very interesting. They ask you very interesting questions. And I'm just like, it's a great question, and I have an answer for it. But it's very unique. So I mean, brava for really leading the way in this kind of weird terrain. And I think TDU is uniquely positioned to lead us out of this pandemic and to whatever this new landscape is going to be. And I take my hat off thrice that you've decided to really devote your first live engagement around health, because I think that is the number one issue for obvious reasons. But I mean, it's just so important, and I'm really glad that's the first thing we get to see. I think it really needs to be heard, So thank you for that.
No, and we're going to be sharing more details via our e-list. So if there are any folks who are tuning in who aren't on our e-list, you can email us at info@thedreamunfinished.org so we can add you and make sure to share all those updates. But you're and also that's me immediately going into flagrant TDU promotion. But thank you, Damian, for your very kind words. That's actually what should have been the first thing I said. And I appreciate this way that this analogy that you've shared around, like, that yes, a lot of the rhetoric right now is around people fighting for a seat at the table, but there are also these groups that are building their own tables. And I really hope that, as we come back and resume our internet, presence via this channel and via podcast and all of these other sorts of like episodelets and like some other ideas that we're cooking up, that we really just want to be broadening that table, because I think we've had a surprising amount of attention given, I joke to people all the time that we live in Google Drive, and like we have basically only done things in New York City, but I'm hopeful that through more sort of internet engagements and through some other future partnerships that we could really start to broaden that table so that more people can be seated at it. But I'm also just so grateful that like we've been able to wrangle you into all of this, and you're not going to get rid of us now, so we just wrangled in further. But I think that's really, I guess, as a final sort of look back, like if you had to pick one piece of music that we had dove into over your time, what would be the one piece that you would say was your favorite to have explored through this experiment?
Oh my goodness. Sanctum by Courtney Bryan. I just think it was the timing was great. Her voice is great. It was a combination of actual words from actual people, and then at the same time interpretation above it. It was I mean, it was just everything I needed for the moment, but there was also this moment of joy that happened in it. I also just think that Courtney is uniquely gifted to at capturing feeling and emotion about things, and I think that was one of the most moving pieces I discovered through this process. I literally watched it and just had I definitely had a sigh. I definitely had some breathing. I don't think I cried, but it was like it was there. I mean, it was possible, but it was just not. But yeah, it was just an amazing soundscape, and then it was coupled with a video of her describing and talking about her process, and there was something to be gleaned from it that wasn't just about composing music. It was also just about composing. And I think she just really captured something about the moment very well. And I think it was also for me, I just finished working with her, and it was also just like a friendly face to see. So I mean, it just lined up for me in so many ways that it just became this great piece. So yeah, for me, it's Courtney Bryan's Sanctum.
Got it. I would say, yeah, it's hard to pick, right?
It is hard to pick. It is hard to pick.
I think the one that is coming to mind for me, I'm looking at our playlist, is probably the one Tio Vicenti, The Forest at Dawn. So he's a Native American composer that Sarah and I had profiled, and this was around when Deb Holland had secured her role in as with the State Department and or Interior. I should know this. I did an episode on it. But it's because I just and obviously all of the composers that we featured we feel very strongly about, but with his music, I think now that I'm sort of taking this step back, I think of everyone that we featured, he's probably the least known. And I really feel like that should be corrected because the music is just so excellent. Like it's just this, and like it's not particularly like it's how do I say, like it's a phrase that classical musicians will often use is like programmatic versus non-programmatic music, or I guess like more sort of abstract. And so yeah, and what that meaning, like programmatic usually follows some kind of like narrative or story. And like I know that The Forest at Dawn has a sort of allusion to like a topic, so to say, but it doesn't have that kind of neat storyline or plot that follows with it. It is really just sort of like music, and it's just so good. Like it's so the engine and the drive that he's able to put in different sections, but then also this like much more like abstract and often veering into the atonal sections, and how he just really the craft that he puts in terms of like navigating from movement to movement,
Hmm.
um, and how he really has the different sort of string parts just be able to propel each other. Every time I hear the piece, I just think of like forward movement, keep it going, like momentum, and just the way that he's able to capture all of that, but then also explore. And like it's very like it's very accessible. Like you can, there are definitely moments where you can hear like a melody. It's a little bit less sort of out there. So I think in that sense, it's also, you know, friendlier to ears.
Hmm.
Um, but but it doesn't sound like same old, same old. Like he's able to really sort of sit on that balance between something that sounds like what is more sort of attuned to people's ears in terms of like popular music, classical music, etc., while at the same time like pushing it just enough so it sounds really fresh.
Hmm.
So that's probably the one that I would put as a little highlight. And
I
I
love,
think
what was the name of the piece again?
it's The Forest at Dawn.
The Forest
But
at
I
Dawn.
think what we can do after we wrap up is like either drop the links back to those episodes in the description, and if someone fancier and smarter
Yeah.
than me can do like the click on video links like in the actual video part, there's a way to do it. I don't know how to do it. Maybe someone else will
It
figure it
won't
out.
be
But
either of us.
yes,
I
that's
bet you we could. I bet you we can get someone on the team to do that for us.
but I think we'll close here, and then we will be
Okay.
back with folks the next time we're back, and we'll
Yay.
give folks a holler when that comes. But
Yes.
yeah. All right.
It's
So
so good to see you.
it's so good to see you, and I'll see you soon, Damian.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.